Without further ado, I want to welcome you to our Ask Me Anything video event in support of Domestic Violence Awareness Month this October. My name is Cathryn Miller-Wilson. I'm the Executive Director of HIAS Pennsylvania. We're very excited to be here today for another installment of our Ask Me Anything video series. If you haven't heard of this series and are curious about what we have to offer, please feel free to go to our website at www.hiaspa.org. We are a nonprofit organization whose mission is to provide immigration, legal, and social services to low-income immigrants and refugees. And I'm very happy to introduce both of our guest speakers who are joining us today, Stephanie Costa and Isabel Abreu, who are co-program managers of HIAS-PA's Immigrant Survivors of Domestic Violence program. Welcome, Stephanie and Isabel, and thank you for being here. This program provides immigration legal representation to immigrant survivors of domestic violence. During our discussion, we will be highlighting the work of Stephanie and Isabel as part of HIAS Pennsylvania and focus on the importance of Domestic Violence Awareness Month this October. So I'm going to start by asking some questions of Stephanie and Isabel. But as you listen, if you have your own questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we will be happy to ask them. If we run out of time and your question hasn't been answered, we will try to post the answers on our website and in a subsequent newsletter. So again, thank you for joining us. So let's start with just asking Stephanie and Isabel, what exactly is HIAS Pennsylvania's Immigrant Survivors of Domestic Violence program?
Kathy, I'll take that one. Thank you for highlighting our program, particularly during this month. I know that there are many important things going on this month. And if you were wondering, having bangs is a prerequisite for being a co-manager of the Domestic Violence program. So to answer your question, you mentioned a few seconds ago that our agency provides social services and legal services. So the domestic violence program sits in our legal services program. And who we serve are low-income survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault residing in Eastern Pennsylvania, where the abuse has occurred in the United States. So this distinguishes us from some of our other legal programs that help folks apply for asylum if people are fleeing from domestic violence in their home country. We do that at our agency, but our program specifically works with folks where the victimization has occurred in the United States, and thus they have specific protections under the immigration law, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Another thing I wanted to mention is that we only help folks with legal immigration services. We have a very small capacity to help with social services through a case manager for our Philly work, but we don't do things like family law, housing, public benefits, etc. We will talk later about who might be able to help folks with that. And then the other noteworthy thing is that all of our services are free if the client is low income and qualifies otherwise. And then other than serving clients directly, a really important part of our work is to work closely with agencies that are providing frontline services to DV survivors, like safety planning, housing, PFA, court accompaniment. While we don't do that work, we work closely with those agencies so that they can identify immigrant survivors of domestic violence who might need help with their immigration status. They can refer them to us and vice versa. And then lastly, which we'll touch on a little bit later, is that we also, in the extra time that we have, we tried to do some advocacy work around local and statewide policies, laws, practices, and try to advocate that these take into account the immigrant survivor's unique experience.
Okay, thank you. So what is domestic violence as distinguished from other types of violence? And what role does immigration status play, if any, for survivors?
I'll take that one, Kathy. So, we most often see domestic violence in the context of intimate partner relationships. And generally speaking, domestic violence is a pattern of abusive behavior within the context of an intimate relationship, whether that is a romantic one or a familial one. And it is abusive behavior that is part of a pattern of exerting power and control over another person. And it can include a range of different types of tactics and behaviors. Most often we think of, in the media, I think traditional forms of domestic violence or stereotypical forms are physical violence, but they can also include things like sexual violence and psychological violence and emotional abuse. So all of those different tactics can include and be part of the power and control that someone is attempting to exert over another person. When we think about the immigrant experience, there is an added layer there's another opportunity for someone who is being abusive to exert power and control by using someone's immigration status against them, whether that is by threatening to withdraw support for paperwork or by reporting someone to immigration authorities. Immigration status can give an opportunity to someone who is being abusive to exert power and control. And so with that in mind, as Steph was saying earlier, our program is specifically dedicated to serving immigrants in the United States who have experienced domestic violence in the United States, because there is that added element of power and control.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to jump off of our planned questions because your response provoked in me another question. How large is your program and how many clients roughly do you serve? I know you wouldn't have that number off the top of your head, but just, I guess what I'm trying to ask is how deep of a problem is it in our area?
Well, Steph, you can jump in at any point, but what comes to mind is that we have to turn clients away. There's definitely more individuals in need of this type of representation and service than our program can currently cover and handle. So I don't know, Steph, if you have a better idea of our actual numbers.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the exact number like Kathy said, but to give you a sense, we have, I'm doing the math in my head, 5 attorneys, full-time attorneys, a paralegal, and a case manager. And each attorney is roughly representing about 100 people at a time, including active cases, cases that are pending, derivatives, which are children of our clients. So it's a kind of at any one point it could look different, but at any point we are roughly talking about 500 plus immigrants that we're serving. And we we started the program like 10 years ago. It was mostly based in Philly, a little bit of work in Chester County. And as our reputation grew and people started knowing what we were doing, people started talking, and now we serve Philadelphia, the 5 surrounding counties, and all of Northeast Pennsylvania. So a huge part of the state. And as you guys can imagine, 5 attorneys can't help all the domestic violence survivors in all of that area. But it's like the more DV agencies know us, the more people start coming out, the more referrals we're getting. So I think even if we think we have an idea of what the problem is like in the immigrant community, every year I'm convinced that we have no idea, and it's much worse than we thought before.
No, I appreciate that. And yeah, so the scope is unfortunately really deep. So there's 2 questions in the chat. One from David Glosser. He had wanted to know, is there a good list of Philadelphia area health and mental health providers for immigrants, refugees, and the undocumented who are struggling with domestic violence?
I could take that question because I mostly work on our Philly stuff. Not really, unfortunately, is the answer. I mean, the DV4, as we call them, so that would be Congreso, Women Against Abuse, Women in Transition, and Lutheran Settlement House. They all provide free mental health services, usually in the form of like empowerment counseling versus like clinical therapy, to survivors, regardless of insurance, documentation, etc. So that's kind of the first place we try to plug survivors in. And then if that doesn't work, then we try to find other places that help undocumented, uninsured survivors, which the list becomes more limited after that. So depending if it's like a family, we might go with like La Puerta Abierta, or the list goes on and on. But essentially, David, I think you worked with Joanna a few times. We can share with you our internal list that you can refer folks to. I'm assuming like after you do a psych eval, then you want them to continue getting mental health services. She can give you our so far list that we've created.
Yeah, so thank you, Stephanie. Full disclosure, I see our audience, many of you work with our team in some form. And so anyway, so for those of you who don't, and you're surprised about the level of questions, I just wanted to give you that context. So speaking of working with us, so clearly we have a couple of questions from some immigration lawyers. One of them, what percentage of your cases are Violence Against Women Act versus U visa applications? And before you answer that question, could you talk a little bit about remedies for immigrant survivors, for the non-immigrant attorneys?
Sure, I can take that, Kathy.
Mhm.
So there are various forms of relief that we pursue for immigrant survivors of domestic violence. Generally, when we're thinking of the options that are available, we start by determining what relationship the client had with the abusive partner, whether they were married or unmarried. And then we also think about the status of the abusive partner. And that is because the best option available is under the VAWA self-petition, and that is for abused spouses of legal permanent residents and U.S. citizens. There are also additional protections for abused spouses of certain non-immigrant visa holders. Those are A, E, G, and H non-immigrant visa holders. Those protections are all under the Violence Against Women Act and provide pathways for individuals to stabilize and regularize their immigration status in the United States without the participation of their abusive spouse. If that is not an option because the client was not married to their abuser, or their abuser themselves was undocumented or didn't have any of the immigration statuses that I just mentioned, there can be other options if the survivor reported the crime of domestic violence to law enforcement. And that option is commonly referred to as the U visa. The U visa was originally created by Congress as a tool for law enforcement agencies to better investigate and prosecute serious crimes, including domestic violence. So it is not an immigration option tailored to the considerations of a survivor. It's tailored to the considerations of law enforcement in trying to prosecute crimes. And that is why it kind of has that requirement that the crime has to have been reported to law enforcement. And then another option that we sometimes consider in our casework is in cases of extreme domestic violence that amounts to a form of human trafficking. We sometimes pursue the T visa, which is similar to the U visa, except it's dedicated exclusively to individuals who have survived human trafficking. So those are the main forms of immigration relief that we pursue in our casework. We do sometimes handle ancillary applications for individuals who've experienced domestic violence, but maybe don't need to stabilize their immigration status. Maybe they want to apply for citizenship or something like that. But that is most commonly what is on our case list. And the vast majority, as the question we got kind of indicates, the vast majority of our work is really going to be VAWA self-petitions, which is that first option that I was describing that is pretty much the best option, or U visas for individuals who are not married to their abusive partner. And actually, the number of cases that we have on our case list is really going to depend on the regions that we serve. So in our program, we have attorneys that are dedicated to serving clients that reside in the city of Philadelphia. And then we have attorneys that work outside of the city. And the immigrant populations that we're working with look differently depending on where they're, settling. So I have a large number of individuals who live in northeastern Pennsylvania, around Lehigh and Northampton County. And so a good number of my cases are actually VAWA self-petitions, and they come out of that region. That's because I think most of the people that settle in that region tend to have been married to U.S. citizens or legal permanent residents. So in my case, I would say like 50% of my cases are VAWA self-petitions and 50% are U visa cases. That's going to be different. I think Steph would give you a different answer because she serves mostly Philadelphia-based clients. Steph,
Yeah, I think the other thing, well, that's exactly right. Like in Chester County, our attorney that works there does like 90% U visas and could do 100%, except she wants to spice it up in her case list a little bit and not just do one type of case. So we sometimes pull in cases from other counties. But one thing that I was going to say that's super important and extremely unfair is that the ability to get a U visa sometimes depends on where you live. So some law enforcement is you have to get a U visa certification saying that you were helpful to law enforcement. Isabel mentioned that before. In some places, the police are willing to sign these certifications. They don't have to by law. It's not required. And they are more reasonable in what they expect of participation or cooperation from survivors. In other regions, like we've had some police departments in the Northeast just say, we don't sign you visa certifications. I don't care what the situation was. And so that is another, that's why by region, the caseload might look differently because sometimes applying for U visa is just not possible. And we often have to tell people that we can't help them, even though they're eligible for this benefit. We're not able to get a certification for them. So I just wanted to clarify that because it's not just eligibility, unfortunately, with the U visa, it's also discretion from law enforcement, which is a huge piece of it.
So, and thank you. Speaking of which, another attorney has written in the chat that she's been having a very difficult time obtaining certifications from counties in PA like Lehigh and Lancaster versus Philadelphia, which is very good with it. Do you have lists of certification contacts for various counties for U visas? Or is there any other way that you go about trying to combat this problem?
Sorry, I had trouble unmuting there. So we utilize a national list that is maintained by, I can't remember the name of the nonprofit. ICWC stuff, you can jump in here. But internally, we have yet to create a list of certifiers. We do know where we're more likely to get a certification just because of repeat contact. So we get certifications from district attorneys' offices in Delco, Chester, and Bucks. We also struggle getting certifications the further out we get from Philly, especially in Northampton and Lehigh, and then all of those Northeast cases. And it's always a struggle to determine if we are going to be able to get a cert or not. when we're looking at a new county or a new law enforcement agency. So a good amount of our work is really just educating law enforcement and networking and building contacts with local law enforcement when we can, to encourage them to respond to youth certification requests. But the reality is it's very difficult the further you get from Philadelphia to get a response on a U visa certification.
So great. And just for those of you that didn't notice, if you are practicing immigration law, the list that Isabel was referring to is in the chat. I do want to pull back a second because the discussion reminds me of, you know, one of the major pieces of why our immigration system is broken is that there is far too much discretion. So, you know, you think about survivors of domestic violence who are immigrants. One of the ways that the perpetrator exerts power is by threatening deportation, you know, for those immigrants who don't have status, threatening to get them deported away from their children. And then law enforcement, in my opinion, perpetrates further violence by withholding this necessary piece for obtaining legal status. And legal status can't be overstated in terms of its importance for an immigrant survivor, because legal status is what enables the survivor to gain independence from their abuser, because not only does it protect them from deportation, but also it enables them to get work authorization and to live on their own. They remain dependent as long as their status is in question. So it's really a critical piece of this puzzle, this law enforcement certification for this U visa. If you don't get the certification, you cannot file for a U visa. And the law enforcement's signing is discretionary. So you're totally at hostage. So,
Kathy, on that subject, I did just want to jump in. We do have a project within our program working with Representative Hohenstein to propose a bill that would require that would remove the discretionary aspect of the youth certification process in Pennsylvania with law enforcement agencies. And so that is something that we're really excited by. It's HB 1371. I think it has been proposed at this point in the House. And yes, that's something that we're hoping will lead to some major changes in the way that youth certs are processed in Pennsylvania.
So thank you so much, Isabel. At the end of this program, we're going to talk about ways everybody can help. So here's your first way. Call Congress, tell them to support HB 1371. Do that every single day before or after your coffee. Because it takes a loud outcry to get movement on these issues.
I also wanted to, I see somebody, Mary Kay mentioned building relationships with local law enforcement. So one strategy that has worked for us is to kind of have the domestic violence agencies in the counties be sort of our mouthpiece to law enforcement. They have credibility with law enforcement. Law enforcement calls on them a lot for support. And they sort of have this, you know, dependent kind of relationship. And so Philadelphia attorney coming in being like, hey, can you sign this document for my immigrant client to get a visa doesn't really work. But, you know, advocate that they see showing up with survivors in court every day saying, hey, you know, we hooked this person up with an attorney and they're asking if you could sign this paperwork to work on their immigration case, works much better a lot of the times. So that's kind of like, that's a huge tool that we use, kind of indirectly making those relationships by utilizing the people that are on the ground and know these folks. And we've seen, I mean, you know, I've actually tried just as like a test to request it myself, get completely ignored, then send the advocate with it and get it turned around in 24 hours. So that's great and all, but the U visa is not only for domestic violence survivors. It's for survivors of many different crimes, and not all immigrants can afford an attorney. So it's great that we have these kind of inroads with law enforcement, but it's not fair that the system is built this way, where if you're lucky enough to have an attorney and you're lucky enough that that attorney has these relationships, then you get the U visa. This other person doesn't get the U visa because they're not in that position. So wrapping it back to HB 1371, this would apply to all immigrants that are eligible for the U visa, domestic violence, and other major crimes.
Great. All right, I'm going to change the subject a little bit. There's another question in the chat. Many of my female domestic violence cases have never had formal marriages, especially those forced into cohabitation, childbearing, etc. How does U.S. law regard such informal marital relationships? What's the definition of marriage with the Violence Against Women Act?
You want me to take that, Isabel? So the situations that you're describing would not be considered marriages normally under the immigration law. Common law in Pennsylvania. So let me start from step one. Under immigration law, the marriage has to be legally valid in the place where in the location where it took place. So if you're talking about Pennsylvania, there has to be a legal marriage unless it happened before 2000. I always forget if it's 2001 or 2005, Kathy, you might know common law marriage.
Yeah, I think it's 2001, but I'm not positive.
I think so too. So before, if the couple that you're describing were together before 2001, there might be an argument for common law marriage. I've been practicing for 10 years. I've seen 2 of these cases where that was a successful argument. Otherwise, it would not be considered a legal marriage, and that's where we would look for the U visa or the T visa instead of the VAWA self-petition. Just the plug, Isabel and I are not the experts in the T visa on our team. Our coworker Joanna is. She was a Skadden fellow on our team like 5 years ago now, and built this expertise. It sounds like in some of your situations, your clients, your patients are basically living as the indentured servant of their partners. In which case there might be an argument that it rises to the level of trafficking. It's complicated because there's also a reporting element to trafficking, although it's not required like the U visa. But in some cases where we see relationships like this, like you're describing, we not only are looking at the U, but also the T as options.
Okay. So there's another question regarding a nonprofit that works on matching families to help them adapt refugees. They're not social workers, wondered what kinds of recommendations, obligations might be around mandated reporting.
Kathy, we'll let you take this one.
Okay, that's fine. So typically social workers and healthcare providers are mandated reporters under Pennsylvania law. And what that essentially means is if there is a suspicion of child abuse, it has to be reported. After the Penn State sexual abuse scandal, the laws, the Pennsylvania legislature made an attempt to kind of tighten the mandated reporter laws by including basically anyone who works with a child. And Amy, thank you. Understanding that witnessing domestic violence between adults is also considered child abuse in New York. It can be in Pennsylvania, but it's a little bit more of a gray area in Pennsylvania. And so that means if you yourself are a non-professional and you witness domestic violence and you know the child was there, then you have an open question about, do I have to report? While I personally can't answer that question, what I can say is that at HIAS Pennsylvania, trying to keep families together, trying to keep children as well as the victimized parents safe means that we err on the side of trying to internally discuss the consequences of any kind of report. Because, as you can imagine, Child Protective Services is not really the best mechanism for families. They tend to kind of swoop in, break up the family, and not really do anybody any good. So what we are trying to do at HIAS Pennsylvania is try to protect the parent and the child, both of whom have been victimized, by giving them the legal status that they need so that they can safely separate and live independently. So I'm not sure that that was a full answer to your question, but certainly in Pennsylvania, the laws have been broader. But we argue that as lawyers, confidentiality and privilege attaches, and that we're not going to do anything that would harm our clients, if that makes sense. Okay. All right. So I am going to go back to my questions, but really great questions in the chat. Thank you so much. Keep them coming. So are there any particular populations that are at a greater risk of experiencing domestic violence?
I can take that, Kathy. Domestic violence, I think we all know, is a problem in all populations in the world, unfortunately, and continues to be a serious problem. But we do know that there are certain groups that are at higher risks of experiencing domestic violence. And in the US, there have been studies that show that groups that experience higher rates of poverty or have lower educational and employment opportunities are at higher risk of experiencing domestic violence. And when we think about the features of the undocumented population in the United States, that lines up pretty closely with those risk factors. So I think it's a safe inference that the undocumented population in the United States would be at a much higher risk of experiencing domestic violence as opposed to other groups and populations.
And I think that's a nice segue to the next question, which we've already alluded to a little bit, but to speak about more specifically, which is, how does domestic violence impact the lives of immigrants and refugees differently than it does for other survivors?
Yeah, so we mentioned some, you, Kathy, mentioned some, and Isabel mentioned some, but I wanted to go a little bit maybe deeper. There are many ways in which domestic violence is exacerbated by the survivor being undocumented. Something as simple as the abuser threatening to hide their passport, their only form of ID, or their birth certificate, or even their visa, which doesn't know, so that they can't return, it can be a huge deal, right? You mentioned threatening to call immigration. That's definitely a tool of power and control that abusers use. But I think, especially when we're talking about the VAWA cases, we see like a more sophisticated level of abuse vis-a-vis the US legal system. So we'll see abusers say, well, I'm going to file for custody, and because you're undocumented, the children are going to come with me. So if you leave or if you call the police, the end result is you're not going to have your kids anymore. Or the kids might also be foreign born, and they might say, okay, well, I'll leave, and the United States is not going to care where these kids are, so you're going to have no relief if I just take the kids and go somewhere else. Another thing that we see often is that the abusers will use like DHS, which is something we were just talking about, or Children and Youth Services if you're out in the counties, the threat of getting Children and Youth Services involved in their family as a way to continue to control and abuse their spouse or their partner. And also in VAWA cases, what we often see is that the immigrant is relying on their U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident spouse to petition for them. So there's that constant, oh, we'll do it next month. Oh, well, I'm not going to do it for you if you don't do this for me. So they are relying on that person for legal status. And that just creates an immense amount of pressure and makes it so that clients feel like they can't leave. And then you add to that the reality that when they come to us and they finally got the courage to remove themselves even temporarily from the situation, we say, well, it's going to be like 7 years before you have a work permit, because that's how long a U visa is taking. Or even in the VAWA context, it's going to be 3 years before you get a work permit. And also, there's not really any housing options available for you, right? And also, if you don't go to criminal court and see him, which is really scary, we're not going to be able to get a U visa certification from you in the first place. So even when the person has gained the courage to remove themselves, there are endless amount of barriers that are specific to them being undocumented still. So it's both, right? It's the specific tools of power and control related to their status, and then it's all the barriers, even if they can remove themselves, that they face once they're trying to gain independence. And so, I mean, you know, this is like their status makes the situation just much, much worse.
Thank you. So I want to change gears a little bit. You mentioned earlier that your program also serves sexual assault survivors. Are they eligible for the same types of immigration remedies?
I'll take this one too. So Isabel mentioned before, sexual assault can be and often is part of domestic violence. So to the extent that that sexual assault is part of the intimate partner violence, then yes, they would be eligible for the same benefits. However, we're ordinarily working with, or historically, our program has worked with adults, mainly women, in the context of intimate partner violence. And through that, we've connected with different sexual assault agencies. And we started seeing a trend in referrals for children that have been immigrant children that have been victims of sexual assault in the United States. And we were getting these referrals and kind of trying to figure out, well, should we serve them? Is this somebody that our youth programs should serve? Because we have a youth program as well at HIAS. But because these children that have been sexually assaulted and their families are for the most part eligible for the same benefits, to answer your question, which is the U visa or trafficking visa, or if the abuser, unfortunately we've seen it, is a parent or a step parent that's a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident, they can also qualify for VAWA. We decided that this is a good fit for our program in our specialty. So having said that, we just got awarded an Independence Fellowship. Independence Foundation just awarded us a fellowship, a legal fellowship, to specifically represent abused, sexually assaulted children and their families. The reason why this population is a little bit unique from, you know, the intimate partner work that we do is that they are they are almost always involved with either DHS, Philadelphia Department of Human Services, or in the county's Children and Youth Services, because those are the agencies that are going to be investigating whether or not the child's abuse happened in order to either indicate or not indicate for child welfare purposes. And then simultaneously, there'll be a criminal investigation. And so trying to understand those different processes, the different players, and all that is critical to us being able to do our work. The goal of the program is that we can start getting U visa certifications from the Children and Youth Services instead of relying on law enforcement, since we're having such a hard time with law enforcement in the counties. Children and Youth Services and DHS are written into immigration regulation as a potential U visa certifier. And in Philadelphia, DHS has a protocol for requesting files and signing U visa certifications, and I often go to them now for these kinds of cases. So that is a very long answer to your question. This is kind of like a new area that we're kind of like exploring. One additional type of immigration relief that these children might be eligible for that are intimate partner violence survivors are not is special immigrant juvenile status. Depending on their situation, if one or both of the parents either abandoned, neglected, or abused them, we might be able to pursue special immigrant juvenile status, which is quicker than the U visa or the T visa, so a better option for kids that would qualify for that. The reality is, in our work, the scenario we often see is either an undocumented child and then we're filing for them and their family, in which case special immigrant juvenile status doesn't really work because it only helps the kid and not the family units. Or if the child is a US citizen and the parents are undocumented, the parents might be able to qualify for the U visa for having helped law enforcement investigate the crime. So again, special immigrant juvenile status doesn't really work there because really the client is the parent of the victim, not the victim themselves.
Great, thank you. I just want to highlight something in the chat. Amy Robertson had put in, according to the UN, 46% of women in Afghanistan report physical sexual violence in the past 6 months, as compared to 6 to 8% in Central American countries. And, you know, that's a very interesting statistic, given the recent influx of Afghans. HIAS, Pennsylvania resettled, I think, a total of 125 Afghans as a result of the crisis in Kabul. I don't know if Stephanie and Isabel, if you've seen an uptick in calls from Afghan women that are now in the community from resettlement.
Isabel, do you want me to pop in here? So we personally on our program are not, because most of the Afghan women that are here in the community recently, they have some kind of immigration status, whether that's parole or something else, immigration, or, oh my God, asylum or something like that. So what we are getting more is calls from our social services department who are working with the Afghan women saying, hey, we have this family, they came together, there's domestic violence going on, can you help us connect them with resources in the community? And so we can guide them in that sense, but it doesn't necessarily benefit them to pursue a U visa, T visa, VAWA, because they have a better a quicker legal option, I would say, to legalizing their status. The other thing is that the manager of our new crisis program, who is working with a lot of these families, came from DV work for like 20 years plus. So that's another reason that maybe Isabel and I are not getting those calls, because she sort of knows the playing field and can refer people to resources in the community.
Well, that's great, and brings me to my next question, which is, what are some resources available to immigrant and refugee survivors of domestic violence?
Thanks, Kathy. I'll take that question. So there are two main resources that we'd like to highlight. They're both basically a clearinghouse for, connecting people to other resources and partners that might be serving the population. So there is the local Philadelphia Domestic Violence Hotline, and then there's the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And they're pretty similar. Philadelphia is just a regional resource operated by the 4 main domestic violence service providers in the city, but they're both 24-hour hotlines. They provide, their operators speak English and Spanish, and they use interpreters for other languages. And they can provide crisis intervention and guidance on, involving the police and how to call 911, safety planning, and then referrals to local providers. So, for example, connections to shelters that might have beds and can house individuals who are fleeing their home. So both of those resources are great. If someone is in need of assistance and they don't live in Philadelphia or very close to Philadelphia, then it probably makes more sense for them to call the National Domestic Violence Hotline. The hotline also takes calls from family members and friends of survivors and can provide advice and guidance for those individuals as well. And they will connect individuals to any hotline that is operating within their region. In terms of additional resources, it really depends on where a survivor is living and what region they're in. So we have just seen generally there can be resources available in the city of Philadelphia. Generally, the further out that a survivor gets from a metropolitan area, there are less resources for survivors. For example, there's less beds in county shelters than there are beds within the city of Philadelphia. But then specifically thinking about the immigrant population, the further out that someone gets from Philadelphia in eastern Pennsylvania, there are less culturally and linguistically appropriate services available for that population. And that is something that our program is very aware of, and we hope to see change at some point.
Great. What are some main takeaways that you'd like people to focus on during Domestic Violence Awareness Month?
I think I have three kind of wrap up things. One is just, we've talked about this basically throughout the whole chat, which is that there is a higher prevalence of domestic violence and sexual assault in immigrant communities, largely due to the unique barriers they face. So that's kind of like the first takeaway. The second one is, and honestly, when Isabel and I were kind of like chatting about the takeaways, this one's a hard one to say because there's so many nuances, but any survivor in the United States has the right to be protected physically from domestic violence. So regardless of immigration status, somebody should be able to call the police and protect themselves from abuse, that's imminent abuse that's happening. And also somebody should be able to go to the family court or whatever state you're in, whatever it's called, and get a form of restraining order, protection from abuse order in Pennsylvania. That's what the law says. Does that happen in practice? Sometimes no, but it's really important for survivors to know, to be empowered that they have these rights. And hopefully they also have an advocate that can help them navigate the nuances depending on where they live. And also the risks of calling the police, because it's not black and white. That's why I was saying it's a little bit hard to say that, because yes, somebody has the right to be protected, but there also could be consequences for immigrants, which is like a whole other complication that they have to face when they're deciding whether or not to call the police. But folks should be encouraged to seek protection because they have the right to do so. And then the final takeaway is that if you have reason to believe that one of your clients, I see like mostly professionals on here, one of your clients, patients, etc., is in this situation, you don't have to ask somebody about their immigration status straight up. I know that's something that makes a lot of service providers kind of anxious. How do I bring it up? Sometimes it comes up because of insurance, and sometimes it comes up for another reason, but sometimes it doesn't come up and it could be kind of tricky to navigate that. So our advice is always to say, hey, there are agencies that help survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault in Philly and Pennsylvania. And if you would be interested, I can just provide you the number and you can think about it. That leaves it on the survivor to decide whether to call or not without exposing themselves to you or to another person in your office, and gives them the power to take that step without being intrusive. So the two places that we would recommend referring your clients are to the National DV Hotline, like Isabel stated, and or to our program, specifically if you know that they need help with immigration legal services. If they call our front desk and maybe they already have immigration legal services and they're an immigrant facing DV, our receptionist will refer them to the DV, the national hotline, and also has some local resources that they can share with the referral. So when in doubt, refer and offer the information, even if somebody is not explicitly telling you about their status, but if you have reason to believe, offer the information and folks can give us a call safely.
Okay, great. And for those of you who don't know, in terms of language access, our team is our entire domestic violence program staff are all bilingual in English and Spanish. Stephanie also speaks Portuguese, and I feel like one of you speaks French too, or am I making that up? No? Okay. All right. So Spanish, Portuguese, and then all of our staff have access to a variety of interpretation services that we contract with. So any survivor who speaks any language can feel comfortable that they will be served and their language needs will be met. So, okay. With that, we are running close to time, unless there is one more question. Anyone going once, going twice? Okay. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Stephanie and Isabel, for joining us and providing your insight as co-program managers of HIAS Pennsylvania's Immigrant Survivors of Domestic Violence Program. We try to provide educational programs about our work and the particularized needs of immigrants and refugees every few months. So please be on the lookout for our next Ask Me Anything. Meanwhile, as always, you can learn more about how to support immigrants and refugees at our website, which is again, www.hiaspa.org. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm putting our website in the chat.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Bye.
Take care.